This is a WTTW special presentation. Jimmy Carter Looks at the World. An address to the Economic Club of Chicago. Here is WTTW senior correspondent John Calloway.
Good evening from the International Ballroom of the Chicago Hilton and Towers Hotel, where in just a few minutes, former President Jimmy Carter will deliver a speech on foreign policy issues. And following his speech, Mr. Carter will answer questions selected by the Economic Club of Chicago. And now to introduce former President Carter, here is Patrick Ryan, the president of the Economic Club of Chicago and president, chairman, and CEO of Aon Corporation.
Over the years, the Economic Club of Chicago has been honored by visits from 3 United States presidents. This evening we enjoy again the special privilege of having in our midst another guest who has held this country's highest office and who will share with us his unique experience and wisdom. Of the 40 men who have been chief executives of this country, only a few have gone on to achieve special recognition after leaving office. Our speaker this evening is one of the most illustrious of that impressive group. His accomplishments since leaving office have brought him many distinguished awards and accolades. James Fallows, the Washington editor of The Atlantic, wrote, and I quote, "I think Carter's vision is for each individual to push himself to the limit. He believes there's a moral obligation to make the most of your talents, influence, and efforts. For society, his goal is to rise above these ancient, blind prejudices, the tribal and ethnic feuds that account for most of the world's wars. Carter will probably be remembered, as he should be, for his personal rectitude, as a good man who set an example for others to follow." End of quote. Jimmy Carter was inspired by the example of his mother, who joined the Peace Corps at age 68. He has become today a most powerful advocate in the struggle for human rights. Through his pioneering work at the Carter Center of Atlanta's Emory University and through Habitat for Humanity, he is personally involved in the promotion of human rights, resolution of international conflicts, and alleviation of world hunger. The Carter Center at the university is a highly innovative institution which addresses vital world issues in nonpartisan ways, designed to lead to greater understanding and to practical solutions to complex problems. Habitat for Humanity builds homes from donated materials and sells them to low-income families through no-interest loans. He not only serves on Habitat's board, but often devotes time as a member of the construction crew. President Carter's work with Habitat for Humanity secures him a place of honor in our hearts, just as the Camp David Accords and Israeli-Egyptian peace treaty secured him a place in history. Jimmy Carter, like presidents before him, built on the achievements of his predecessors and bequeathed legacies to his successors. His SALT II treaty was built on the SALT I treaty of his predecessors, and President Bush's work on further nuclear arms limitations starts with the Carter and Reagan initiatives. President Bush's ability to respond so swiftly to the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait last August is largely due to the Carter Doctrine and its creation of the Rapid Deployment Force, as well as its pre-positioning of major U.S. military supplies near the Middle East. Carter administration sales of F-15s and AWACS to Saudi Arabia have also greatly improved coalition combat ability in the current conflict. And I better have some water. That our allies in the present confrontation with Iraq include Egypt and Saudi Arabia can be traced to President Carter's statesmanship in building bridges of friendship with moderate Arab countries. Yale University historian Gaddis Smith says, and I quote, "He's a world ombudsman, constantly traveling, acting as mediator, observer, and commentator. No other former president in our history has done anything comparable to that." End of quote. I consider it a distinct honor to ask you to join me in welcoming the 39th President of the United States of America, Jimmy Carter.
Mayor Daley, President Ryan, distinguished members of the Chicago Economic Club, friends. It's nice to be back in Chicago. We come here on occasion, as Pat Ryan pointed out, to work with Habitat and building homes, but our primary purpose in coming to Chicago is to visit our son and our grandchildren who live in this neighborhood. So grandparents would understand very clearly why we're so delighted to come back to Chicago tonight. The Carter Center, to which President Ryan referred, is an entity that has a wide range of responsibilities, dealing with human rights, holding elections in this hemisphere to end conflicts and to bring about peace and democracy and freedom, working in the Middle East on a long-term program for peace and stability, monitoring what goes on in the Soviet Union, dealing in the alleviation of hunger. Tonight, however, I've been asked to talk about some concerns on a specific subject of conflict and peace. And then following that, I'll make a few remarks regarding the Gulf War and save some time at the end for your questions. I tried to think of a story to illustrate the point I want to make throughout my talk, and that is that in dealing with war and how to alleviate it and how to maintain peace as an alternative to war, it not only requires a powerful nation with massive military forces and strong diplomatic efforts, but also innovation, new ideas, new concepts that really are an integral part of the life of the entrepreneurship that has made our nation so great. I'm going to take one story to illustrate it very quickly, and that is about a young man in a business school who was always thinking of new ways to do things. He was so innovative that he aggravated his professors profoundly. And they were so aggravated that they threatened to fail him because when they would ask a simple question, he gave a complicated answer. As a college professor myself now for 9 years, I know how bad that can be. But in a simple physics exam, the professor asked, how do you measure the height of a building? By using a barometer. And the young man's answer said, there are at least 5 or 6 different ways. I don't know which one you want. So the professor said, okay, I'm going to fail you because I'm tired of your smart aleck answers. So he called the young man in to give him a final opportunity, and the young man said, well, my answer was absolutely correct. And the man said, there's only one way to measure the height of a building. And the young man said, I can tell 4 or 5 ways. And the professor said, okay, you tell me, and I'll give you a passing grade. The young man said, first, I can measure the pressure at the bottom of the building, atmospheric pressure. I can go to the top of the building and get the difference and compute the height of the building. The professor said, yes, that's right, that's it. The young man said, there's a lot of more ways, too. He said, I can take the barometer, stand it on the ground, measure the height of it, the length of the shadow, measure the length of the shadow of the building, and I can determine the height of the building. And the professor was a little more disturbed, and he said, okay, that's 2 ways. The young man said, third, I can get a string tied to the barometer, go to the top of the building, lower it to the ground, measure the length of the string, that's the height of the building. That's 3. He said, another way is I can take a stopwatch, go to the top of the building, drop the barometer, see how long it takes to hit the ground, and I can compute the height of the building. And the guy said, well, I'm still not going to give you a good grade because that's still not enough answers. By that time, the provost walked by, who happened to be in the business school, and he said, if you can give the provost an answer, I'll give you 100 on your test. The provost came in. The young man said, well, I've got a lot of more ways. He said, well, tell me one concerning the business school. He said, okay, I'll take my barometer, go over to the superintendent of buildings, and I'll say, this is a very nice barometer. It's worth a good bit of money. You tell me how high the building is, I'll give you my barometer. Well, the point is, in dealing with war and peace, sometimes the most vital 2 elements in the life of a nation and a society, we need to be innovative in searching for ways to find a better quality of life for us and for others. Tonight, in preparing for this talk, I look back on kind of the history of wars about which I've been familiar. And I'll just give you a brief summary of those. In World War I wasn't born then, but my father was the first lieutenant in World War I. After that, it was known as a war to end all wars. It didn't do it. World War II, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, all those were looked upon with great satisfaction when we won. Not always did we win, but a sense of revulsion by the people of our country and the world when the war was over, and a determination that we would avoid future wars. That has not been the case. Advocates for peace have not been very successful. In the last 10 years, for instance, since I left office, I won't go back before that time, there have been several wars launched from one nation to another, or either brief attacks across international borders. One was the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982. Another one was the U.S. sending troops to Lebanon and the subsequent bombing and strafing of villages around Beirut. The U.S. bombing of Libya, the U.S. invasion of Grenada, the U.S. invasion of Panama, the promotion of the Contra War against the Sandinista government in Nicaragua, and then finally this past year, the invasion by Iraq of Kuwait. The reasons for these wars are multiplicitous. It's hard to draw a distinction or a formula by which peacemakers can prevent wars because the reasons are so wide and broad and unpredictable. The control of land, of the seas, of transportation routes. Sometimes a war is launched just to convert an alien society to one's own philosophy or one's own religion, to secure wealth, money, mining, oil, to overthrow a despised regime, to empower or to establish a friendly regime, or to alleviate one's own domestic problems. In all those wars I mentioned, in almost all of them, there was an anticipation of an easy victory, and that quite often does precipitate a war. If an invading country, an attacking country thinks they're going to win easily, that's the case. The Soviets, for instance, invaded Afghanistan December, Christmas week of 1979. They thought they would have a quick victory. Iraq went into Iran in 1980, expecting an easy victory because Iran was torn apart by revolution. When Israel invaded Lebanon, they thought they would have no trouble in establishing a Christian-oriented government that would be friendly to the regime in Jerusalem. And of course, last year, Iraq thought they would have an easy victory when they went into Kuwait. Another important factor is that quite often leaders believe that their invasion, their initiation of war will promote popularity. And sometimes this is very much the case, particularly if the victories are easy ones. But popularity can be quickly lost. Truman, in 1952, in the midst of the Korean War, decided not to run for re-election, although he was qualified to do so because his popularity had reached an all-time low for presidents at that time. In 1968, Lyndon Johnson announced that he would not run for re-election because of the unpopularity of our being bogged down in the Vietnamese War. Prime Minister Begin in Israel resigned from office partially because of the unpopularity and the lack of success in the invasion of Lebanon. In modern days, there are some stabilizing factors that tend to help those who work for peace and try to prevent war. One of them is instant communications, which opens up in this new electronic age an ability for people to communicate with each other, to learn about the motivations, the fears, the opportunities of resolving disputes through direct talks. Another is the publication of the ravages of war. This is one of the reasons that the Vietnam War eventually came to a conclusion. International borders being inviolate. Since the colonial powers withdrew, particularly at the end of the First and Second World War, they drew lines on the map, sometimes quite arbitrary ones, particularly in countries in areas that had been controlled by them. In the Middle East, drawing Jordan, drawing Syria, the boundaries of Lebanon, in Africa, delineating more than 50 countries, which were formerly just 15 countries. And now those international boundaries have become sacred. It is very difficult, very unlikely that the community of nations will approve any change in international boundaries. This provides a great deal of stability, but for instance, in the case of the Baltic states, part of the Soviet Union now, unfortunately, that prohibits the support that might go to their total independence and their total sovereignty. The holding of elections has been a recent phenomenon on the political scene that permits the end of a war, like in the case of the Contra War in Nicaragua, and the prevention of wars by alleviating tension between contending parties. Another one has been the fear of mass destruction. The Cold War that we experienced with a great deal of concern was certainly better than a hot war. And it's very likely that had we and the Soviet Union not had overwhelming nuclear arsenals, we might very well not have maintained the very delicate relationship between the two superpowers, in spite of the fact that on several occasions wars did threaten. The Cuban Missile Crisis when John Kennedy was president is one example. Another was in the October War in 1973, when Israel was advancing beyond the Suez Canal toward Cairo. And the Prime Minister of the Soviet Union went to Cairo, and there was a possible confrontation between the two superpowers then, including nuclear power. President Nixon alerted all American forces around the world, including nuclear forces. The Soviet Union did the same thing, and because of that concern about the consequences of a nuclear holocaust, that war was terminated peacefully. Another example, of course, was in the Afghanistan invasion by the Soviet Union. The Soviets bogged down in Afghanistan, and I made a speech to the Congress of the United States, my annual State of the Union speech, and I pointed out that if the Soviets tried to move from Afghanistan down through either Pakistan or into Iran, that we would consider this a direct threat to the security of our country, and we would respond accordingly. Because the Soviets at that time, had they been successful, and there are many secret reasons why they were not successful, and had taken over the Persian Gulf and controlled all the world supplies, all supplies in that part of the world, it would have been a direct threat to us. Few of these constraints that I've mentioned to you very briefly apply to civil wars. Let me give you a very quick picture of the way the world was last August the 1st, 1990, the day before Iraq invaded Kuwait. The Carter Center, as part of our work, monitors all the world's conflicts, working with a university in Sweden called Uppsala. At that time, on that date, there were 112 conflicts in the world. 30 of them were major wars, wars within which more than 1,000 people had died on the battlefield. Of those 30 major wars, not a single one was between two countries. Every one was a civil war, a domestic war, war between neighbors within the boundaries of a single country. That's interesting. Some are very large and formidable wars with hundreds of thousands of people being killed. But the tragedy is that the United States, nor the Soviet Union, nor France, nor Great Britain, nor even the United Nations is authorized to deal with or to resolve those civil wars, because it is absolutely improper for our diplomats or for the UN officials to have any communications with revolutionaries who are trying to change or overthrow a government that is a member of the United Nations. This leaves a horrible vacuum on earth. Let's just look back briefly to review what I've said. Afghanistan, Iran, Lebanon, Nicaragua, Grenada, Panama, Kuwait. This is an average of one international war or attack across the border every 2 years. And there have been no victories by the attacking forces except when the powerful military forces of the United States were marshaled against a smaller country. In no case were all the diplomatic options exhausted. Back and forth delivery of ultimatums from one leader to another is doomed to failure. There is a way to deal with threats to peace. But there are formulae that haven't often been exerted. Just let me give you one example, and I had 2 or 3 mentioned here, but I want to save time to answer questions. In 1978, many of you would remember that the prime example of terrorism was a hijacking of airplanes. Almost every month there was a plane hijacked, and it was flown to Cuba or Libya, and that was received with great accolades and approval by either Gaddafi or by Fidel Castro. Giscard d'Estaing, the president of France, and I decided at the Economic Summit Conference that we would try to stop this practice, at least as far as Libya was concerned. So we got the other leaders in the powerful Western nations, Japan, Canada, Italy, France, Great Britain, and Germany, to send Gaddafi a private message. And we told him, all of us signed the letter, if you ever again accept an internationally hijacked plane and don't immediately return the plane to its owners and the hijackers to justice, then all international airplane traffic between Libya and our countries will be permanently terminated. This was a secret message, and because it was secret, we didn't throw down a public gauntlet to him or challenge him or dare him. He did accede. He never again accepted and kept a plane. In the times when a war is contemplated, propaganda efforts are very effective. There can be a rapid shift of alliances between countries. Just think back in recent months or years, our relationship with Manuel Noriega, who for a time in Panama was an ally helping the United States train Contra troops. Later we invaded Panama to capture him and perhaps bring him to justice later on this year. Saddam Hussein, up until the 2nd of August last year, was supported by our government because we preferred to have Iraq prevail than to have the Iranians win that war. Assad, the president of Syria, condemned in the past as a terrorist leader, or at least one who supported terrorism, is now one of our allies in the war. China has gone back and forth between an entity greatly revered in this country and admired and one that's been condemned for human rights. Now, at this time, since they support our operations in Iraq and Kuwait, they are our friends again. The public wants to be convinced that we are right, that we are superior, and our enemies are somehow subhuman. Let me just mention now about Saddam Hussein and his relationship with Iran. I mentioned earlier that in Christmas week of 1979, in the midst of the hostage crisis, after the hostage crisis involving Iran had been going on about a month, Iraq invaded Iran. Saddam Hussein thought that he would have an easy victory because Iran was divided, torn apart by their long-standing revolution. I condemned this invasion because I was afraid that Iraq would conquer Iran and destabilize the entire region, or that his invasion might endanger the lives of the American hostages held there. I consistently condemned this attack. One of the most notable public servants at that time was Harold Brown, who was my Secretary of Defense. Harold Brown was a scientist. Before I recruited him to be Secretary of Defense, he was the president of Caltech, one of the world's greatest engineering schools. He had been nominated for a Nobel Prize in physics. He had been the former Air Force Secretary in Lyndon Johnson's cabinet. Harold Brown was superb in his knowledge of strategy, his knowledge of modern technology, and how it might be evolved or used in weeding out obsolete or obsolescent weapons and in establishing weapons that would be innovative and effective in a possible future war. So out of Harold Brown's appointment came the evolution of a stealth fighter plane, the stealth cruise missiles, the evolution of cruise missiles that were effective, launched from surface ships and from airplanes. We worked very hard on the Patriot missile system. We put into effect a prohibition against the building of the B-1 bomber because we felt it was not be fruitful in the past, and we established the Rapid Deployment Forces. Subsequently, of course, that war came to a stalemate. But it was because Saddam was not punished, and because he later received enormous support from Europe and some degree from this country, that he got the temerity, courage, misplaced courage, to go in to Kuwait. Since that time, when he has been confronted by world opinion and by actions of the United Nations, he's always had two options: to withdraw from Kuwait, which he must do eventually, the sooner the better, and save his forces, or to stay in Kuwait, permit his nation to absorb enormous punishment, and fight an extended land war. That's still the options that he has. Either way, the United States would not find his choice very attractive. We still face that prospect, although now it's more likely, of course, that we will fight an extended ground war. I think the later we begin that war, the better off we will be. But after we do destroy the military forces of Iraq, after we do destroy their electric power grids, interrupt their fresh water supplies and electricity in the major cities, damage beyond use their oil refineries and their steel mills, interrupt their transportation system and their communication system, and then force the Iraqi forces out of Kuwait, then what is our next step? That is a crucial issue that we face in the future. Today, President Bush was briefed by his military leaders, who I understand from television tonight have basically said, let's don't be in a hurry. Let our supremacy in air prevail. The U.S. forces are resolute. They are superbly trained, and there's absolutely no doubt that they can and will prevail. After 60,000 sorties already, with almost non-existent opposition from the Iraqi forces, there's no doubt in my mind that Saddam Hussein and his Iraqi supporters, including private citizens, must know that this one-sided devastation can continue indefinitely and that they cannot win. But the private foot soldiers and the individual citizens of Iraq are not the ones who will decide that the war needs to come to a conclusion. As you know, in recent days, the Soviet Union has been increasingly critical, claiming that the United States has exceeded the mandate of the United Nations by bombing throughout the country, whereas the mandate, they claim, was only to force Iraqi forces from Kuwait. Our own key Arab allies in Saudi Arabia and in Egypt have called for a temporary ceasefire during which negotiations might be carried on. The Iranians, of course, have joined in this effort. So far, Saddam Hussein indicates no willingness to withdraw. But as the forces of war continue to be marshaled against him, as his forces are both decimated and also forced to retreat, we have to be prepared for a possibility of negotiation to deal with the ultimate leadership of Iraq, either Saddam or one of his successors, as soon as he decides and announces his willingness to withdraw from Kuwait. This war is a special case for us now. We're all preoccupied with it. We don't want to talk about much else. But in the future, the new world order, brought about by a cessation of the long-existing Cold War between us and the Soviet Union, must include the prevention of further major conflicts and the resolution through peace negotiations of those that do exist. A measure of the greatness of a nation, including ours, is how strong a force for peace we can be. Now our duty, charged to us by the world community of nations, is to force a restoration of the independence of Kuwait. All Americans support that commitment. We hope and pray that our forces will be successful soon and that losses on our side will be minimal. Following that, however, it's the duty of leaders and citizens of our country to marshal again the reputation that our country is not only a force for the preservation of international borders and strengthening the international law as we're doing now, but we are indeed a force for the preservation of peace. Thank you very much.
Thank you, President Carter. The first question is, during your administration, you supported investments in the conventional warhead cruise missiles and stealth fighters, which have proven successful in our recent conflict with Iraq. On the other hand, our commitment to new funding of defense technology seems to be waning. How will this impact our military strength and position over the next 10 years?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, we were blessed in our country with a Secretary of Defense who knew not only the physics and advanced technology that was available here and in the rest of the world, but knew how to apply it. And as new weapon systems were initiated and deployed, part of our program was to decommission those obsolete systems no longer needed. I also brought in to be the Deputy Secretary of Defense the former CEO of Coca-Cola Company to make sure the Defense Department did operate in a business-like way. All of us realize that our country is in the forefront of the world in its university system. We may not be as far advanced as the Japanese and others are in putting into effect in the consumer field the results of our research and the winning of Nobel Peace Prizes and the innovative programs that we are able to vision. But the university system that we have is superb. And I would hope that in the future we'll continue to see the Defense Department working with scientists, particularly in our great university system, to evolve concepts and ideas that would not only contribute to victory if we get into a war, but also to make sure that our country is so formidable in its military capabilities, but also so wise in its political policies that we can prevent war. After I left office, the emphasis on these advanced technologies was not really maintained. President Reagan had a different concept from what I've described. Although I vetoed the B-1 bomber because I and Harold Brown and others saw no future for using the B-1 bomber in a predictable war, that was reinitiated at the cost of about $50 billion. Although we did have the stealth technology, which makes a flying vehicle almost totally invisible to radar. We use this for cruise missiles that are only about 21 feet long and for fighter planes. Under President Reagan's administration, they expanded this to the B-2 bomber, which is an enormous bomber. It looks like a flying wing. And we also put a major investment in the so-called Star Wars program, a program to intercept incoming intercontinental missiles. As you know, this is a fairly ancient concept, in, at least in our lifetime. The anti-ballistic missile program negotiated by President Nixon with the Soviet Union authorized anti-ballistic missiles to be developed. The Soviet Union did indeed develop theirs. We began to develop the anti-ballistic missile program in North Dakota, but eventually President Nixon made a decision to decommission it. Well, my hope is that we can use a simple commitment to use our technology for weapons that will actually be used in war, but to repeat myself, not to use these weapons if possible, except to maintain the peace.
During your tenure, you established the framework for a national energy policy. It would appear that the U.S. has abandoned this policy, and we have once more become highly dependent on imported oil. What changes should be considered to deal with the problem of our dependency on foreign oil?
The day I was inaugurated president, we were importing about 48% of our oil from foreign sources. I worked for 4 years, almost ad nauseum, trying to get a comprehensive energy policy for our country in a multiplicity of ways, emphasizing, first of all, conservation. We passed laws that required automobiles year by year to be increasingly efficient, and we increased the efficiency of our average fleet of automobiles from just 12 miles per gallon then, ultimately to the new fleets being required to have an efficiency of 28 miles per gallon. We mandated by law the insulation of homes, new homes built, and changed the structure for charging people for electricity use to discourage rather than to encourage excessive uses of electricity. In addition, we promoted increased exploration from oil in our country, and the use of solar energy and other alternative sources. That's the basic principle. That is the basic principle on which I think our future energy policies should be predicated. Over a few years, when these laws went into effect, and many of them are still in effect but not rigidly enforced, we cut from 48% down to about 30% of our oil being imported. Now, in this past year, we passed the 50% mark. We are now importing a greater percentage of our energy than ever before in history. So I believe that it has to be a very broad-ranging and multiple program, but the primary emphasis ought to be on conservation, not continued waste, with the hope of developing new sources of energy in our country. I'm particularly opposed, for instance, to the development of the Alaska Wildlife Region on the northern coast of Alaska that Rosa and I visited last year. I think that saving energy by increased efficiency of automobiles, the use of electricity is a much better way. And this has to be done in concert with other countries. It's hard for Americans to realize how much energy we do waste. For a given level of productivity, for instance, the United States uses 2.5 times as much oil as does Japan. We use twice as much oil for a given level of GNP as does Germany. This is part of the concept that we have now in the United States that it's okay to waste energy, but primarily conservation, alternative sources of fuel, increased production and exploration in our country, and mandatory efficiency requirements in the U.S. law.
The situation in the Soviet Union is very fragile and certainly uncertain. In light of these circumstances, what is your view on our current policies and the threat of nuclear war?
Well, I think one of the most startling developments in the world political system the last 5 or 6 years has been the advent of Mikhail Gorbachev, who in international policy has had a superb string of notable victories or achievements. He's not done well at all in his own country, and his popularity overseas is almost diametrically opposite to what the people in the Soviet Union think of him. He's at the bottom of popularity in his country. And I think the economic problems in the Soviet Union are basically his fault, because he's now been in office 6 years, and reforms that could have been made earlier with a dynamic and innovative commitment to a free enterprise system and a free market have not been implemented by him. His boldness and his wisdom in international affairs has been quite opposite from what he had on the domestic scene. Specifically, though, I don't think there's any likelihood in the near future of having a reversion to a Cold War where we might anticipate a nuclear conflict. Although we still have in the world about 30,000 nuclear weapons, most of which, of course, are owned by the Soviet Union and we, and they have not, those arsenals have not been reduced by any substantial amount at all, and this should be a very high priority. It's now on the back burner. And as you know, in the recent days, there has been kind of a tacit agreement that we don't particularly want to interfere in destabilizing Gorbachev's regime by condemning his action in the Baltic states. On the other hand, we don't want him to withdraw from support of the Gulf war policies of our country. But I don't anticipate under any circumstances a resumption of deep and penetrating animosity between our two countries. Also, many of Goldwater's international achievements are irreversible, whereas formerly we faced a formidable Warsaw Pact array of weaponry and personnel in Eastern Germany. Now that pact has been totally destroyed, and the East European countries that have received their independence through democratic processes approved by Gorbachev are not going to go back in to the Warsaw Pact arena and present a threat to Western Europe. The most vivid example of that is obviously Eastern Germany. So I think that what Gorbachev has done, what we've done together, is a permanent benefit to the world and will be stabilizing and not destabilizing for the future.
Speaking of Gorbachev's reach around the world, What is your view of the near-term future for Cuba? Yes.
Well, as our country well knows, since Castro came into office, there have been some slight fluctuations in the interrelationship between the United States and Cuba. One of the things that I did when I came into office, it wasn't all that popular, was to remove all travel restraints on American citizens. At that time, there were a long list of countries to which U.S. citizens could not go. And I removed all those restraints so that an American citizen, I think it was the right decision still, could visit anywhere in the world we wanted to, including North Korea and Albania and Cuba included. We also established an interest section in Washington and in Havana, not an ambassadorship, not full recognition, and those interest sections have been kept open by President Reagan and by President Bush. When Gorbachev initiated glasnost and perestroika in the Soviet Union, Castro soundly condemned Gorbachev's move toward democracy and freedom, maintaining that he would never reverse his total communistic control over the nation of Cuba. He's never varied from that commitment. And recently, he's made some statements since Gorbachev has gotten back in bed with the military and the KGB that Castro maintains that he's been right all along, that we are now seeing the proof that Gorbachev's policies were ill-advised. So certainly in the near future, I don't see any change in the possibility that we might have easier relations with Cuba. I would personally like to see travel restrictions eliminated. I think a best way to bring reforms in Cuba and to lead that country to cast off the iron restraints of Castro would be to open up Cuba to free visitation by Americans, Cuban Americans in Miami and around our country, and others, to let the people in Cuba know that there's a better way of life just 90 miles from their shores. If Castro ever does weaken as he grows older and older, and would like to leave a legacy of permanent freedom in his country and calls for free elections to be held in Cuba, I would be very glad to volunteer to go down and orchestrate the elections for them.
You are a hero to many. Who is your hero, and what are the qualities you most admire in a leader?
Well, as far as presidents are concerned, my number one hero has always been Harry Truman. I have to confess to you that I have never met a Democratic president. And so all of you who shook hands with me today at noon and tonight have something that I've never had. I hope in the future, though, I'll be able to correct this deficiency in my life. But there's no doubt in my mind that Harry Truman has been the hero for me, and for many reasons. One, he was a very quiet man. I think he was absolutely honest and sincere. I don't think he would dream of using a U.S. 3-cent stamp on a letter that he wrote his mother back in Missouri. I think he was that meticulous about honesty. I don't believe Harry Truman ever lied to the American people in any way. I've studied his speeches and his talks and his public statements. I've never seen any place where he deliberately misled the American people, even in the smallest way. Harry Truman exemplified the best characteristics of our country, particularly at the end of the Second World War, when he put into effect the principles of human rights. And it's because of Harry Truman's wise policies, supported by his very strong and powerful and able assistants, including George Marshall, that we now have Germany as a democratic nation and our friend. We now have Italy as a democratic nation and our friend. We now have Japan as a democratic nation and our friend. Just think how different the world would have been had Truman had a punitive attitude toward those former Axis countries that fought against us. So for many reasons, I could go on and on, since he's one that I admire most. I could talk about Harry Truman, but I think his simplicity, his honesty, his wisdom, his commitment to human rights and the basic principles of our country make him a true hero for our country.
The strong commitment during your presidency to the advocacy of human rights worldwide was backed by specific actions such as economic and trade sanctions. What priorities should be given to dealing with the apparent human rights violations taking place in the Soviet Union today?
Well, again, I think that one of the greatest attributes of our great country is to be the acknowledged champion of human rights, to raise high that banner and to maintain it. The thing that oppressed people fear most is silence from Washington. And the thing that oppressors want most is silence from Washington. Unless the leaders of the United States speak out as champions for human rights and freedom, there is no other voice in the world that can be heard with attention and with results. We still have a very strong human rights policy at the Carter Center, but it obviously doesn't compare to what I had when I was president. As president, I designated every ambassador of the United States as my personal human rights representative. They gave me daily reports when necessary on what was going on in the country where they were stationed. Every American embassy in the world was a refuge place for those oppressed by their leaders. Now, Amnesty International, the Lawyers Committee on Human Rights, Physicians for Human Rights, America's Watch, Helsinki Watch, Asia Watch, Africa Watch, leaders come to us at the Carter Center and bring their most troublesome human rights violation cases. And in a fairly ineffective but sometimes effective way, I go directly to that leader of the country within which people are being arrested and incarcerated without trial, where they're being tortured in prison or executed for nonviolent political crimes. And in a surprising number of cases, my intervention has been effective just because they don't want to be exposed by me or branded by me as a human rights oppressor. But of course, my voice at the Carter Center is insignificant compared to the voice of the President in the White House. So I let all the world leaders know that the relationship between them personally and me as President would be affected by their human rights policy. And the relationship between their nation and my nation would be affected. We vetoed World Bank loans to those countries if they didn't desist from human rights violations. A constant effort by me, always, followed obviously by President Reagan and others, was to make sure that the Soviets did release Jewish families and others to be reconciled or joined with their family members overseas. And I think this has been a notable achievement since Gorbachev came in office, to permit hundreds of thousands of Jews to go to Israel or to other places on occasion. So I think that in general, the Soviet Union has moved toward honoring human rights. Lately, however, with the threat of his nation being fragmented and republic by republic declaring their independence or autonomy, Gorbachev has tightened up considerably. And although there still is an ability of, say, people in Lithuania to demonstrate on the streets, and even this week to hold a referendum, they don't have the freedom that they had a few months ago. And also he's putting tight restraints now on the press and on freedom of expression. So it's not a horrible case like it was before he came into office, but I think the trend is backwards. And I would like to see President Bush and Secretary of State Baker continue to make the kind of statements they made recently, condemning these reversions of the Soviet Union toward human rights violations that characterized their country in the past.
You have been extremely active in both domestic and international affairs since your presidency. What do you think should be the role of a president in his or her post-presidency years?
Well, just as everyone in this audience is individual and you have your own priorities in life, on what career to choose, where to go for an education, how to expend the talent or ability that God gave you, what to do when and if you reach retirement age, I think presidents ought to have that same right of individuality. One of the tragedies of our country has been in this century that many or several of our presidents who would have had notable post-White House careers did not survive the office. obviously Franklin Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, John Kennedy, even Lyndon Johnson had a massive heart attack just about 11 months after he was replaced in the White House. And of course, different ones have different careers. I never have been always very careful not to be critical of other former presidents who have chosen their own way of life after leaving the White House. As you know, a few years ago, there was a great deal of furor after President Reagan left the White House because he went to Japan and received a very high fee for making a couple of speeches. When we had a Carter administration reunion in Washington, I said that it was far beyond me to criticize President Reagan for that successful speech trip, that if anybody heard of a similar situation that I might have, to let me know. So what I do and what Rosen does as my full partner is just a thing that interests us. You know, we enjoy writing books, we enjoy being professors, we enjoy working at the Carter Center on various issues. This past week we went down to Haiti, for instance, to complete a 3-year project, finally to bring democracy and freedom to the people of Haiti, the first time since our nation was founded in 1804. Last year, year before now, we were successful in helping to bring about a successful election in Nicaragua to end the Contra War and to have a transition that was peaceful from one country to another. We go to Africa on occasion to help plant corn and to immunize children, to eradicate disease. Those are the kind of things we like. Just one week a year, we get a lot of credit for what we don't do. Just 1 week a year, we go out and act as carpenters because we enjoy it. And the fact is, the point is that the things that we do that I've just described to you are not sacrifices. You know, it's just a privilege and a pleasure to do things that are exciting and innovative and gratifying and totally unpredictable in our lives. But I wouldn't advise that any other president pattern his or in the future her career after the White House after what we've done.
Although you haven't talked about the budget or the trade deficits tonight, we do have time for 2 questions, and I'd like this to be the second last one. The budget and trade deficits have taken a backseat to the war, yet these issues continue to be major concerns. What policies and programs would you prefer to see in place to deal with the current budget deficits?
Well, when I left office, the federal debt was about $1 trillion, an amount that had accumulated from George Washington's time to mine. And within 8 years, that level of federal debt had tripled. And I would guess that this year, the actual federal deficit will be between $400 and $500 billion. Various subterfuges have been used to conceal the debt in dealing with the S&L problem, taking money out of the Social Security Fund, and so forth. I don't think we've yet seen a commitment by the President or the Congress to deal with this question effectively. When I left office also, we were the world's greatest creditor nation. 2 years ago, we had become the world's greatest debtor nation. We owe foreign countries more than any other nation in the world. In fact, we owe foreign countries more than all the third world countries combined. You may or may not remember that in 1988, election year, President Gerald Ford and I had a program called the American Agenda. We had 400 of the top experts in this country, 200 Republicans, 200 Democrats. And we dealt with a multiplicity of issues. At that time, the savings and loan problem was not even publicized. But we spent at least half our time trying to understand the causes of and the corrective actions necessary to deal with the savings and loan question. The other issue on which we spent most of our time, more than any other third issue, was the deficit. And President Ford and I took to President-elect George Bush 2 weeks after he was elected our proposals, and they called for substantial reductions in federal expenditures and also substantial increases in revenue. This was contrary to the read my lips commitment of President Bush, but it was a carefully considered recommendation where a combination of reduced expenditures and increased taxes and other revenues could have brought our deficit under control. That has not yet been done. And I think it would be foolish of me to stand here and tell you that there's a magic or easy or painless way to deal with the deficit problem. And when I talk about $400 or $500 billion, I'm not even counting what might be our country's contribution to the Gulf War. But there going to have to be a drastic commitment made sometime in the future to cut down on the deficit. A lot of that problem obviously accrues to the balance of trade deficit. And until if and when we get our deficit under control, I think our country is going to continue to be in a, I'd say, in a bad competitive position with other countries. Another point on competitiveness is that, as I said earlier, we have the finest university system on earth. Our elementary and secondary schools don't measure up. Also, most of the chief executive officers, say in Japan, like Tom Watson used to be with IBM, they know their companies. They know every assembly line. They know most of their workers' names. They know their customers. They know their products. They know marketing techniques. They know the foreign countries. They know what's going to be happening 5 or 10 years in the future in that particular work. We don't have that in the United States anymore. Too many of our CEOs have taken over with junk bonds and so forth and have very little actual knowledge of those kind of things that I just mentioned, assembly lines and so forth. These things will come about as a change in the future, but I'm not here to tell you magic answers to either the deficit or the trade balance. Those are just a few maybe biased opinions of a retired politician and a present peanut farmer.
This will be our last question. What was the single most satisfying aspect of your presidency, and how do you feel it will be remembered?
Well, I think that two things that historians now mention after 12 years or so that I've been out of office is the peace efforts that we mounted. Whenever there was a troubled place in the world, I marshaled all the resources I could possibly gather from our greatest of all nations to negotiate, to mediate, to try to bring about a resolution of the problem peacefully. And the other thing we did was try to be the champion of human rights. I made my mistakes. Some of the things that we attempted were not successful. But I think as the years go by, the fact that the United States, at least for that time, was a champion of peace and human rights are the things that make me most proud. And I hope that in the future, if I am remembered by historians, it would be for those two characteristics. Thank you very much.
Thank you, President Carter, for those profound thoughts and sharing your wisdom. Thank you very much. We are adjourned.
And you've been watching a live broadcast of former President Jimmy Carter's appearance before the Economic Club of Chicago. I'm John Callaway. Thank you and good night.